Okay, well, welcome to the Sacred Heart Peace Community's 2022 Gathering for Peace and Justice. Our theme this year is American Democracy in Peril. How should people of faith respond? This theme was chosen by the Peace Community at Sacred Heart in the summer of 2021, but I think most people would agree that it's becoming more and more relevant almost by the day. And we've invited two speakers to address this question from different faith perspectives. I'd like to begin by introducing Father Vincent Guest, who is the pastor of Sacred Heart Parish. And I will ask Father Guest to open our gathering with a prayer. And then I will turn the microphone over to a longtime peace activist, Mr. Bill Hartman, who is a member of the Sacred Heart Peace Community, and he will introduce our speakers. Father Guest.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning to all. Thank you for those who are leading our discussion today and our co-sponsors, and especially our speakers, Ken and Eileen, our panelists this morning. We gather with all God's love, and let us pray as we begin our conversation. Gracious God, we dream of a world that's free of poverty and oppression, a world that allows all people to express their vote, a world free of vengeance and violence. Together we gather and pray for peace. Peace in Ukraine, which is troubled by war, and peace in all troubled spots of our world and our cities. When our hearts ache for the victims of war and oppression, help us to remember, dear God, that you heal us with your touch of love. Give us faith in our ability to comfort and heal bodies and minds and spirits that are broken by violence. When injustice in this world seems too much for us to handle, give us faith, dear God, to move on. When fear and power and opinions of others tempt us to walk away and not speak up for the least among us, give us courage to follow you and your way of peace. When we ourselves are filled with anger for those who are violent and oppressive, help us to remember our call to love even our enemies. Give us, dear God of all love, the courage to bring peace to our worlds, our families, our neighborhoods, and to the world. And help us remember our call to sacrifice ourselves in serving you and our neighbors. Help us, dear God, to be peacemakers. Increase our compassion, our generosity, our hospitality for the least among us. The courage, the patience, the courage, the honesty, the gentleness of spirit that this world so desperately needs. We pray, dear God, to you, a God of all love, and give us the love in our hearts to be people of peace, now and forever. Together we pray, amen.
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 Bill, will you introduce our first speaker?
Yes. So good morning, everyone who's joined us for this event of the Sacred Heart Catholic Church Peace Ministry team that we have worked on. Sacred Heart Peace Ministry has been an active source for some hope for nonviolence and end of war since around 2003-04, when the Second Iraq War started. And we gathered from that and created this effort on our part. So we've been at it for a while. Last year we gathered in February, and we had Jim Forrest, who's no longer with us in life, as well as Kathy Kelly. And we spoke at that point and had the Zoom affair because of the pandemic. And we decided to stay in pandemic mode this year with our effort now with the Zoom. Our decision to go with this topic, as Steve was alluding to, we kind of organized it around the idea of what happened at the Capitol in 2021 and the need to try to address the issue of how do we as people of faith make some measure of effort on our part to hold on to our faith, but our belief in what we have in our democracy, what is fractured right now, but so much part of our lives, is for ourselves. Not only that, but our kids and grandkids. So we're searching for optimism in the current political times that we're in, and we're relying on some measure of faith and belief that all of us hold in some measure. We have to be more than just political to be able to get through the minefields of what lays ahead of us. And I was reminded, looking at the Sun magazine that I get, it's a writing and poetry magazine, that for all of us in school, we grew up saluting the flag at the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. And that measure of doing that on a daily basis kind of put us in two modes. It made us citizens of the country as a little person growing up, but it also made us very much attached to the political side of that as a salute to the flag. We also, if we were in Catholic schools, we prayed and did our morning prayers in school as well. So all of that part of it. So today we have two speakers. We have Eileen Flanagan, who is with us. She is a member of Quaker Meeting and works out of Philadelphia in the Chestnut Hill area, but she's all over the place. She travels and does a lot of work for the international effort of Quaker efforts for nonviolence and peace and community, which has been part of our lives for 400 plus years. And then we have Father Ken Hallahan, who is with us as well. And Father Ken had been actually a member of the curia, or of the clergy. Let me not put you in higher up, but at Sacred Heart for years, and retired just a few years ago, pre-pandemic, BC, before COVID, and has been working out there in our world, trying to do good things for everyone. And we reached out to him as well as one of our speakers to address the topic. So I'm going to let Eileen begin by just telling us a little bit about Evoke and the other work that you've been doing pre 1 January 6th. And then moving on beyond that, I'll let you finish up. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm going to structure my talk a little differently than what Bill just suggested. I'm going to start with the assumption that I don't have to say too much about the problems, because you probably wouldn't have stayed inside on Zoom on a beautiful Saturday if you weren't already concerned. But I will acknowledge two parts to our current situation. I was recently part of a conversation of Quakers drawn from different national groups to talk about, is there a special thing that Quakers might be called to in terms of defending democracy? And a very similar theme to yours, like democracy in peril. What are we supposed to do? What are we called to do? What can we do? And one of the things that struck me in that conversation is that there was a man who's been a leader among a group called Friends of African Descent. So a Black Quaker man who is a lawyer who represents tenants' rights. And so he works with a lot of poor people. And he said, you know, from my perspective, it's not like our democracy was really working great before. And I thought that was a really important reminder because there's been an escalated level of concern about democracy in the last few years, certainly January 6th. And all the state bills, you know, being passed since then to restrict voting rights. And so there's that particular crisis of something happening now that is unprecedented in US history, but it's in a context of a long struggle over who can and cannot vote in this country. And so I'm going to divide my talk into those two themes, starting with what can we learn from past struggles. So I'm not going to talk that much about Quakers, but I'll slip a little bit of that in there, including my work on climate change. Climate change and racism are the two issues that I've worked the most on in my life. So I want to start by sharing my screen and going to one particular campaign in US history that I think we can really learn a lot from, and that is the Selma campaign for voting rights. This is a picture from the final walk from Selma to Montgomery, where people of faith were very, very visible and played a really important role in dramatizing the need of people with a moral conscience to stand up and be on the right side of this historic issue. So I'm gonna use this story to share a theory that I find extremely helpful in working on any kind of issue. And that theory is called the 4 roles of social change. And it came from the work of a sociologist who actually was a Quaker sociologist named Bill Moyer, not to be confused with the guy on PBS. And Moyer studied a lot of successful social change movements and discovered that they all had in common people playing different roles. So when we ask that question, what are people of faith called to do in this time? I think it's important to recognize we won't all be doing exactly the same thing, that the tools of discernment about what is my particular calling will be important for us to use. But it's also important to understand how those particular callings may fit into a broader social movement. So the 4 categories I'm going to use are advocate, rebel, organizer, and helper. And I'm having trouble advancing. Here we go. Advocates basically try to make change using the tools of the system. So this is a picture from the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So this was a really important moment for passing legislation that would ensure voting rights, right? It's being chipped away now, but at the time it was really historic because voting rights had been so denied, so many people. And certainly there were people who lobbied for this bill. And there were people who, were part of the process of crafting it, of knowing how the legislature works and how to write into law important principles. But advocates don't have to be elected officials. They can be the people who make phone calls or write letters or even participate in elections, working at the polls or working for a candidate. Those are all tools that the system gives us that are methods that we can use to make change. And I want to make this a little bit participatory, even though the chat is closed. I wonder if people could physically raise their hand, or if you know how to raise your hand electronically on Zoom. I just want to get a little poll of the group. If you have participated in advocate style change work, like calling or writing to an elected official. I'm curious how many people here have been part of that. Oh, great. I'm seeing lots of hands. So another category, and I'm seeing even more people raising their hands. Great. Advocacy is really, really important, but it's not the only way to make change. So in the civil rights movement was an era when it became really important that when the system is dysfunctional, we also need what are called in this model rebels. So rebels are trying to make change by breaking the rules of the system, by elucidating what is wrong with the system. And so this is a picture, the 2 men on the left, Joseph McNeil and Franklin McCain, are part of the Greensboro 4 young college freshmen in Greensboro, North Carolina, who realized the system was just not working for them at all. And they had been learning about nonviolent strategies and decided to go down to Woolworth's and order a cup of coffee. Now, the system of Jim Crow segregation said it was illegal for them to do that. They wore their nicest clothes. They very politely sat down and simply ordered a cup of coffee as a way of breaking a rule that is so unfair that they're breaking it shows what's wrong with the system. So this picture was actually from day 2. This tactic spread. Many students in many cities took up this tactic, And within months, Woolworths changed their policy and desegregated their lunch counters. Part of what was important about this rebel strategy was that it enlivened the Black student movement and led kind of circuitously to the formation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council, which John Lewis, a famous congressman, spent most of his life being an advocate, but as a young man, he got his activist start as a rebel. He was engaged by these nonviolent student protests, became leader of SNCC during the Selma to Montgomery March. And in a system that was functioning, marching from one city to another would not be a rebel move, right? We should have the right to do that. But in the segregated South, it was absolutely a challenge to the system, the simple act of peaceful walking. And so I'm sure many of you know this history. Some of you maybe lived through it. Some of you have seen it on television or seen the movie Selma, which I highly recommend. But what happens when this initial wave from the first attempt at this march crosses the bridge is that they are met by violence by the police. So I'll just say that the rebel role can be played lots of different ways. And the one that I strongly recommend is keeping nonviolent discipline and prayerfully and peacefully rebelling against an unjust system. And then if you are met with violence, it again is one of those things that shows what is wrong with the system. So this is a picture that actually got picked up and spread across the country of one of the main organizers of that first march was Mrs. Amelia Boynton. The organizers are the people who call their friends, say, hey, we're going to do a thing. And because this march was met with violence and she was in the front, she became a symbol of it. She was actually nearly beaten to death by the police, and then one of the police sprayed tear gas into her throat. The picture on the left is her. She went on to live to be 103 and was still very lucid when the movie Selma came out and recalled those events. But what I want to say a few more things about organizers. Organizers can participate in any kind of tactic. So they might organize people to make phone calls to politicians, or they might organize people to march, or they might organize people to do a sit-in. What distinguishes organizers is that they are oriented toward bringing people together. Let's get everybody together and then see what we can do. And many of the organizers of the civil rights movement who are male are well known, but there were many, many women who behind the scenes were mimeographing the flyers and doing the things that helped turn people out. I'm sorry, I forgot to do the raised hands for the rebels. So let me just pause and see how many of you have been part of what you would think of as maybe rebel activism, of breaking the rules, not necessarily getting arrested for it, but doing things that are more challenging to the system. It may be fewer of us, but I'm wondering, okay, we got some rebels. Just to raise your hands to acknowledge that. Great. Thank you. And what about organizers? How many of you identify as the person who calls other people together? Okay, I see some hands up for that as well. Oh, a lot of organizers. That's great. Yeah, I'm an organizer by orientation and have participated in different kinds of tactics. I ended up joining a rebel group, Earthquaker Action Team, that works on climate change issues because it was so clear that advocacy wasn't going to work as long as our politicians were taking millions of dollars from the fossil fuel industry. So people can play different roles at different times, but the organizers in particular can shift depending on the historic moment that they're in. The last group is called helpers, and helpers are extremely important and often unrecognized. I actually couldn't find out who cooked the food for all the church meetings that happened around Selma, but Georgia Gilmore is one of those who's remembered for feeding many civil rights campaigns. So she may have been involved in this one. She got her start during the Montgomery bus boycott, where they had huge church meetings and, you know, people needed food and water, and it's often women behind the scenes doing that work. When movements are not in a time of crisis, the helpers may be simply, you know, making soup for the soup kitchen, or tutoring kids in the school, or playing those roles meeting direct need. But in moments of kind of crisis, when movements are coalescing, then they may step into this kind of role, like Georgia Gilmore, of feeding the people who are in the streets, and that kind of thing. We need all of the roles. I could have just as easily told the story of the struggle for women's suffrage, and all 4 roles show up there. And whatever work we're doing around democracy, we need to figure out how people can bring their various gifts to it. I want to say one thing about this picture is from the 1963 March on Washington, which many credit with pushing for the Civil Rights Act prior to the Voting Rights Act. I think my generation learned the wrong lesson from this march. I have gone to so many marches in Washington to protest the invasion of Iraq, to protest gun violence, like so many things. I've been part of groups where the answer is, let's go to Washington. And, you know, maybe we stand in front of the Lincoln Memorial, maybe we stand in front of the Capitol, maybe we stand in front of the White House, but basically it's the same orientation, get on a bunch of buses. What I came to understand after learning more of this history is that the reason the March on Washington in 1963 was so powerful and so groundbreaking and effective was that it was not a singular event. These people in the crowd, at least 100,000, many believe it was 200,000, many of them were back in their communities fighting to desegregate the lunch counters or the voting booth or the buses. They had been in those campaigns playing all those roles. And then they showed up in this big moment to kind of display the collective power. But when they went home, they went right back to registering voters and doing all those things. And I think many of the groups I've been part of have thought that if we just send enough people to Washington, that politicians will listen. And in fact, that's not true. They need to be experiencing pressure from all sides for it to really work. So I want to pause just to acknowledge, like, in this moment, when we think about threats to our democracy, there are different ways people can participate. And when we get to Q&A, if people want to kind of share organizations or mention, you know, organizations they want people to know about, I'm happy to have that passed on if the facilitators are open to it. I want to shout out a few. Network is a Catholic social justice lobbying effort that my husband is very involved in. He's one of the leaders of the Philadelphia branch, and later I can put in the chat some contact information for him or for the national organizer. My understanding is that New Jersey doesn't have a super active group yet. And so if there's anybody who feels motivated to work on lobbying from a progressive Catholic perspective, a lot of what they've been working on is around voting rights. So they're playing that advocate role, calling representatives and things like that. Helpers could be doing voter registration. They could be the people bringing the snacks to the polls. There are lots of things that kind of make our system work. And we saw, I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but we saw in the last election that those people doing their jobs well was actually really, really important. So again, this is a role that often those people don't become famous, but the volunteers who really run the American electoral system on the local level are incredibly important. I'm not sure who in your communities is doing a lot of organizing, but here in Philadelphia, Power Interfaith is really important, a multiracial interfaith movement that does that work of bringing people together across religious bases on a number of issues, including voting rights. And maybe you know of people using rebel tactics around these issues. I actually don't. I think that we need to prepare ourselves for that. And it was one of the things that was said during this Quaker meeting. I was sort of struck by how many people said we need more training in nonviolent direct action. Oh, I forgot to acknowledge the helpers. I'm sorry. I had this great idea for being participatory and then I didn't do it consistently. So before I move on, does anybody want to raise their hand to like acknowledge that they've been part of the helper crew too? Yeah, very important. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to skip the helpers. So before I continue talking about electoral issues, I want to say one thing about my own rebel work, because I think if some of you feel drawn in that direction to the power of nonviolent direct action, there are other movements right now that are using nonviolent strategies more so than around voting rights. And so you might as well come on down and get some more experience and training. And also it's a democracy issue too. So climate change, as I mentioned, is one of my primary callings. It's very, very frustrating to write a letter to your elected official and discover that he has taken millions of dollars from the fossil fuel industry. In fact, I would say it's further evidence of what's been broken in our electoral system for a long time. In 2016, the organization that donated the most to congressional committee chairman races around the country was Exxon. So no matter who gets to vote for those people, if Exxon is the major funder of their campaigns, that's something broken in our democracy. So the group I work with, Earthquaker Action Team, was founded by Quakers, but includes people from a variety of backgrounds. We tend to take on corporations because we believe they have such a disproportionate amount of power in our country and in the world. And so the corporation that we're targeting is Vanguard. Vanguard manages $8.2 trillion. They're one of the biggest investors in Exxon, in Chevron, in many of the companies really fueling climate change. And they are behind other asset managers in dealing with climate change. So I will also later drop in the chat a website if you're interested in learning more. I know that there are going to be people from a lot of different faith backgrounds, including my husband is drumming up Catholics because he's a member of St. Vincent's in Germantown. Walking from the Delaware River to Vanguard headquarters. It's a 5-day walk. It's probably the only thing we have in common with the walk from Selma to Montgomery. We do not expect police violence, but we are, it is another 5-day walk. And there is likely to be civil disobedience at the end for those who want to participate in it. And many people will not be participating in it if that is not what you feel called to do. So this is a little diversion from the theme of the day, but I wanted to share it for 2 reasons. One, if you feel called to the rebel role, but the other is to say that for me, protecting our democracy is not just about expanding and protecting voting rights. It is also about diminishing the role of corporations in in running so much of what the political bodies do. So the other main thing I wanted to talk about today is the actual possibility of stealing elections, a coup. And part of the work I did that Bill kind of alluded to, but to spell it out, I was the trainings coordinator for a group called Choose Democracy. Choose Democracy was founded by a few people who in, I guess it was the summer of 2020, saw from Trump's behavior, including in Portland and other things, that he might not go quietly if he lost the election. And the three people who founded this group, George Lakey, Daniel Hunter, and Jenny Marilu, I think, I always forget how to say her last name, were all trainers of nonviolent direct action. And they said, well, what are we called to do? We know how to train people. So that is our piece. So part of figuring out our own role as people of faith is to ask, what am I already good at? And George and Daniel are also both writers. And so they said, let's get the word out about the threat that we see coming, and then let's try and train people. And over a matter of weeks, we trained over 10,000 people in nonviolent strategies to prevent an election-related power grab, was the way we worded it. Many people also called it a coup. If we actually have a coup, what are we going to do? And so I was brought on as trainings coordinator, which was an amazing whirlwind effort. And the trainings themselves were based on, again, study of history of what has worked in the past. There were other groups that were also sensing this threat. We had some friends at a group that called themselves isthisacoup.com, and they put on their website what they called the coup-o-meter, to kind of measure where are things now, like how acute is the threat to democracy. And in December and early January, I found myself looking at their coup-o-meter pretty frequently to see what was their assessment of what was actually happening. But a lot of the work of Choose Democracy was actually before those dramatic moments. In the trainings, we encouraged people to go and organize a local group and ask their politicians, no matter their political party, to commit to counting every vote. And although many of the people who founded Choose Democracy were Democrats, they recognized that it was really important that this be nonpartisan, and that they were really calling on people's highest ideals of what we want our government to be, regardless of one's political party. And that turned out to be incredibly important. If you remember, prior to January 6th and after, many local election officials verified the vote even when it didn't go the way they had wanted. Those people were critical to making Trump's attempts to subvert the election unsuccessful. Many of them got death threats. Many of them have continued getting death threats and are not sure they want to stay in those positions. So I think one role for people of faith is to look out for, do we have people who really want to volunteer for these roles or get elected to these roles in some cases, and be committed to supporting the outcome no matter what it is. And this goes to the question of what's different about beating a coup than just the normal kind of advocating or organizing for voting rights. We called on a Quaker historian who spent his career actually studying coups and how people responded to them. And he had studied many coups around the world where nonviolence won. Nonviolence overthrew the coup, even when the military was involved and things like that. And so that became a key part of the training, is like, what can we learn from those stories of people in other countries? One of the things that became clear early in that is that this kind of moment when someone is trying to steal an election is actually different than the moments that many of us have experience in. So in normal organizing, in normal pushing for a bill, there's people for it, there's people against it, there's a bit of a power struggle, right? But in a coup, the most important people are the people in the political middle, the people who don't have a lawn sign up, the people who see themselves as very mainstream. And what history showed was that it was what the people in the middle did that determined which way the coup went. And so that's why being nonpartisan in this kind of moment is really important. So, for example, on January 6th, if it had become an issue of Democrats versus Republicans, it would have been much, much messier. But that small group of people on January 6th who were trying to subvert the election they were denounced by many Republicans by the end of the day. And so it became people who want to follow the rule of law and people who don't. Since then, there's been an amazing effort to make what they did seem more mainstream than it was. And I think it's part of this political polarization in the United States is part of what is dangerous about this moment. We have to make it not just about what the Republicans did, but what this small group did to try and subvert democracy. And I'm just going to talk a tiny bit more about that and then move us toward questions. So in looking at those case studies of places where people succeeded nonviolently in thwarting a coup, it turned out they had 4 things in common. They were able to mobilize people on a widespread basis, getting large parts of the population across political parties. And so instead of it being us versus them in a narrow sense, the us became larger, which was why our group was called Choose Democracy. So it's about the principle of democracy, regardless of what your particular politics are. There was, in all of the cases, a refusal to recognize illegitimate authority. So demanding that every vote be counted, only accepting the results if they're fair. And in many countries, if they felt like the results weren't fair, that a coup was going on, then people would refuse to pay their water bill or their electric bill or go to work or things like that. And in fact, in the United States, prior to the 2020 election, there were a lot of people quietly organizing to do this if Trump actually had been more successful at a coup attempt. So for example, the flight attendants union was prepared to have kind of like rolling strikes. And the plane can't take off if the flight attendants aren't on board. It's not just about the coffee, it's a safety thing. And so if the flight attendants went on strike, that could be really crippling to air travel. There's somebody unmuted. If you could remute yourself, that'd be great. So again, alliance building is part of what makes this widespread, bringing in whether it's unions or faith groups or college students or moving beyond the usual protest suspects is really important in a moment of a true threat to democracy. And the final one is nonviolent discipline. When people were able to remain nonviolent, they were much more likely to win. Now, this training was like 2 hours, and I cannot go into all the details. I cannot tell all the stories, but I wanted to just give you those glimpses of things that are important in a moment of real peril to democracy. and just offer one example, the Philippines. So in the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos was elected in 1965. He was reelected, but then he declared martial law in 1972. So we know that sometimes dictators get elected first and then grab power or try and hold on to it illegitimately. Marcos actually stayed in power a long time. It wasn't until 1985 that he was really pressured to have another election. And it was clear that he intended to steal it. And by then, there was a mass movement of people really ready to nonviolently stand up to him. It took a long time. There was a lot of criticism of the Catholic Church hierarchy of being a little too comfortable with the dictatorship or equivocal in, they did criticize human rights abuses, but in some ways they chose law and order over justice in the early years. There were always from the beginning priests and nuns and other Catholics, as well as people of other faiths in the Philippines who were working for democracy from the very beginning. But part of what shifted in 1986 was that the center moved, right? The people who weren't either super right wing or super left wing, including the Catholic bishops in the Philippines. They came out against what Marcos was doing, and that played a really important role in sort of shifting the dynamic in that country. There was at least 1 million people in the streets. Faith leaders were very visible, praying for peace on the front lines. And there are many things that can influence whether the military takes the side of a dictator or takes the side of democracy. But I think as this picture shows, probably those soldiers all went to Catholic school, and the nuns being in the front row makes it harder to shoot them, right? In the same way that on the Selma walk, the final walk in Selma, and this photo is from Selma, where many people of faith showed up. The final walk did not meet with violence. There was a court order. A lot of things had happened in between the first attempt to cross the bridge and the final attempt to cross the bridge. I don't want to oversimplify that history, but the fact that so many different people of faith showed up and said, this is a moral issue, we have to stand with justice, I think was really important in the ultimate success of both the People's Revolution in the Philippines and of the march from Selma to Montgomery, which was absolutely key in getting that Voting Rights Act passed. So just to spell out a little bit more specifically the role of people of faith in these stories, first of all, I do believe that love is a force more powerful. So I believe that people showing up grounded in love actually makes a difference. And in fact, Father Vincent's prayer at the beginning was like an amazing call to that, about loving our enemies, the call to sacrifice, the call to be peacemakers. I think all of those, when people come in that spirit, it makes a huge difference to movements. Spiritual grounding and prayer, I think, can help people to stay nonviolent. I see that in my own work with Equate. When we start with prayer, it changes the action. And sometimes we just stop in the middle of the action and have prayer if kind of things are getting a little heated. So I really can't underestimate the importance of that, in my opinion, in nonviolent action being successful. I also think faith can support courage and make people more willing to risk their own safety. I don't know the role that played for John Lewis in walking across that bridge, but I think for many people in the civil rights movement and in other important movements, the belief in something bigger than themselves, in a life beyond this life, was part of what enabled them to be incredibly brave. I think having people of faith on the front line helps to convey moral authority and helps to convince those people in the middle that this is the right side to be on. I think the pictures that I found of this, definitely having clerical outfits or things like that that identify people as kind of officially religious can be important symbols. I think all of these movements probably have Quakers in them, but we're not as visibly obvious because we don't have any special clothes. But I think that it's important to recognize that that's part of a media story too. And finally, that moral messaging can move people beyond partisan politics. So it's not about my party or your party, but when we can really speak in moral language, that there's a strength to that. And I'll say one more thing about the Choose Democracy effort that I did think, even though it was not affiliated with any religious group, had a strong spiritual basis. And that was, I think, one of our most important impacts was in reminding people to breathe. This was a slide from the training, to remind people not to get carried away with their worst fears about what was happening, and to do some grounding, and let's really look at the facts of what's happening. So for example, leading up to January 6th, there were a lot of people debating what should we do, and debating if progressive groups should all show up at the Capitol to be a counterbalance. And we, among others, felt that that would actually not be good, that if it became Trump supporters versus Trump opponents, it would actually be way more likely to escalate into violence, and it would give Trump an excuse to call in the National Guard if his opponents were there. And so Daniel Hunter, one of the founders, got on the phone with other activist organizations, including leaders of Antifa, and said, stay home. The most effective thing we can do on January 6th is stay home and make it clear to the world that these people are the problem. And that presence of mind, I think, was really, really important. I think that if my side had shown up in large numbers, it could have been much, much worse. And so that's not so much religion, but I think spiritual practice, to have the self-awareness to say, I'm feeling really anxious, but that is not the same as thinking strategically about what will help this situation. I think I'm gonna pause there, and I'm really curious what's on people's hearts and minds. Yeah, I think I'll just pause there and say that for me, this is a time of grounding, of regrouping, of figuring out what our roles are. In that Quaker conversation about what we might do, there was a lot of talk about we need more training and more preparation, because I don't think we're out of the woods with the threat to our democracy. And if there is another coup attempt, it may be more effective than this one was, which it was not particularly effective as coup attempts go, but they may well have learned from their mistakes. So I think I'll pause there and see what's coming in terms of questions.
Well, thank you very much, Eileen. That was an excellent presentation. And by the way, I was reminded that the coup attempt, in some ways, various people are still trying to execute it. So, and try to, say this election was stolen. So that is one concern to me. I do have a couple of good questions already in the chat box. So let me start with the first one. This person says, I am still participating in a group started in that Choose Democracy summer. We will meet this Monday to celebrate Judge Walker's ruling against Florida's SB 90, which was designed to suppress votes. can you imagine a rebel role for such a group? Or are we limited by the political times to other roles?
That's an interesting question. During the trainings, one of the things we talked about is encouraging people to stretch beyond when you go to talk to politicians, not just do the thing you've always done, right? So rebels can engage with political leaders, but with a little more forcefulness. So maybe going and praying in the lobby for a politician to vote the right way, could be a way of bringing some of that rebel spirit, like not leaving immediately when asked. You don't necessarily need to risk arrest to push the boundaries of that. Yeah, I think it partly depends on the exact situation, but I think that's the encouragement that I would have is, or sometimes showing up at people's houses is a way of being more rebel-y. Like politicians are used to you have to go through all their gatekeepers to get to talk to them. But if you go and bring candles, to someone voting the wrong way on legislation, and again, prayer can be both a powerful form of action and a way of signaling nonviolence. So I think there are a lot of things that people could do that would be rebel in the sense of breaking convention and saying, like, this is so important, we're going to break the social norms to get our point across. That's my thought about it. It is a little harder to break the rules but another example would be the Georgia law. Georgia passed this law that it's illegal to hand out food and water to people waiting in line to vote. And they know full well that it's Black neighborhoods who have really long lines to vote. So sometimes in those moments of crisis, things that might be the helper role under other circumstances suddenly become rebellious. Definitely somebody needs to go hand out food and water in Georgia next time there's an election. So I think depending on what the rules are, when things like that are really unfair, breaking unfair rules like the lunch counter segregation can be a really powerful way of showing what is wrong. Whereas the vigil on somebody's lawn is more symbolic.
All right, thanks. I've got 3 more questions. I think we may be able to get to all of them. In Choose Democracy, the pillars of civil life, justice system, police and military, etc., were described, and it was helpful. How do we connect the military and police with fair election results so that they are on the side of democracy when a coup is threatened?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I thought about bringing the Pillars of Power image and didn't, but for those who didn't do the training, basically institutions contribute to how a system works. So it's individuals, but it's also institutions. So like the police, like the military, like the business community, right? Like election officials are kind of their own constituency. And part of the reason Trump's coup attempt did not work is he didn't have any of those major powerful constituencies on his side. The business community did not want a coup. Like, it's just not good for business. Trump was good for business in a lot of ways because he reduced environmental regulation and things like that, but a coup wouldn't be good for business. The military, most of them were not supportive of this. So there are things people can do to shore that up. In Serbia, when they were trying to take down the dictator Milosevic, they actually had a strategy. They knew a day would come where the military and the police were ordered to shoot them, the pro-democracy activists. So they actually spent like a year going to the bars that the military and the police went to and getting to know them and having conversation with them and saying, probably things aren't great for you either. Oh, wait, they pay you late? Someday you're going to be asked to shoot us. Please don't. And actually that worked. When the moment came, the military, like in the Philippines, mostly walked away. In our situation, I think it's a little different, but you know, people who have direct connection to the military are probably in a better position. I have a bunch of cousins who are in the military, and I think many military officers were really horrified by some of the things Trump was doing. But it certainly helped that there were a lot of op-eds after that incident in DC where he pulled the National Guard into a photo op, basically. And he had a Bible too. So the right wing knows how to use religion as a symbol as well, it should be said. But I think there were a lot of op-eds about the role of the military so that people went into January 6th knowing that that civilians were watching. That's the best I have on that, but I think it's a really important question.
All right, so here's the next one. Please explain the difference between rebel action on behalf of righteousness versus on behalf of a power grab.
That's interesting because I think in recent years, we've seen more rebel action on both sides of the political spectrum. You know, we've seen people having protests where they refuse to wear masks because they don't agree with COVID protocols. And, you know, those tactics can be effective for either side. I think the main difference is that it's hard for me to imagine a power grab being successful in this country without violence. And so I think the side of righteousness, it's part of the reason that I think people of faith have such an important role. It's not, loving your enemies isn't just rhetoric, right? It is actually a practice of faith and bringing an attitude of peace. And for me as a Quaker who does nonviolent direct action, there's a little tension between loving your enemy and also challenging power holders when they do the wrong thing. But I think there's a way to do it that still sees people's full humanity. Whereas a power grab might use tactics that look comparable in some ways. But a power grab is not based on respecting everybody's vote. A power grab is not based on loving our enemies and seeking peace even when we disagree. So I do think ultimately they feel very different. But I think it's an interesting question because I do see right-wing groups using this funny mix of violence and nonviolence. And I think we're in a period of extreme political polarization where that's likely to continue and maybe escalate in coming years.
Okay, and I think this may be our last question to try to finish this section on time. So many people who identify as Christians do support Trump and the attempted coup. How can Christians differentiate from, quote, those, unquote, Christians, especially as concerns media?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I guess my answer is similar to my answer to the last question. I think loving your enemies really does feel different. And take the civil rights movement, right? White Christians, you know, King's letter from a Birmingham jail was in response to white Christians who told him, like, calm down, you know, be quiet, wait for justice. And it's a powerful rebuke to that. And I think that part of the power of that movement was that people could see it was faith in action. I guess I'll conclude maybe with a panel I watched on Zoom recently with an Indigenous man. I'm pretty sure his name is Mark Charles, and he has a very interesting TED Talk. He wrote a book on the doctrine of discovery about how, you know, the papal bulls from the Catholic Church justified colonialism and the very destructive role that played. But Mark Charles is himself a Christian pastor. And he was on this panel kind of asking him about, like, you know, what's your role as a Christian pastor while writing about the harmful role that Christianity has played? And he said, I think the problem is basically that we lost the message of Jesus, and that Christianity as a whole became more identified as the religion of empire than the religion of the poor and the religion of love. And that, like, I'm still committed to being a Christian, but it's that, not this. And I think it's a struggle to overcome the powerful association between Christianity and the flag and Christianity and empire. But I think it is part of the work of faith today, is to reclaim what, to me, and I think to many of you, faith is really about, and not let it be co-opted in the ways that it has been and continues to be. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much, Eileen. Why don't we have a round of applause for that excellent presentation? Really appreciate that. And Bill, I think we're going to turn it back over to you next to introduce.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Eileen, very, very well done. I appreciate your thoughts, your words, and where your heart is in this. And hopefully some of us will get out to see you and walk with you going to Vanguard, even for a day, if people can get out. If you got 5 days, it's well worth the time. I want to remind everyone that we are asking you to put questions into the chat to Bob Moore. I also want to suggest to all of you that we're doing this webinar with Eileen and Ken, Father Ken Hallahan, but we are asking for donations to help take care of this and give them an honorarium for their time with us and the effort that they did to put this together for us. So if you could either address an email to get a permanent address to send a check to for us for Sacred Heart, you would either send it to Joe Clementi, and Joe's email is jclementi, CLEMNTI photo @gmail.com. He's a photographer, or myself, and I'll put my email in the chat so you can get that there, but it's billhartman949 @gmail. So just to those two things, so that we can provide some honorarium for our speakers and a little bit of something maybe for CFPA as well, who we are affiliated with. Now, Father Ken Hallahan is here with us. He has a history at Sacred Heart. He was an associate pastor there with Father Michael Doyle, who has survived for 45 years as pastor up until right before the pandemic was beginning, when he stepped down after so many years of ministry. And Father Vincent Guest, who's here with us, who is a lawyer as well as a Catholic priest, is serving at the parish, all three parishes in southern Camden. Father Ken is a professor emeritus. I'm not sure if he's still teaching anything, but I think he was for sure at LaSalle University, which was my alma mater from bachelor's degree way back. He has had an Hispanic apostolate over the years and worked with the communities around both the South Jersey area, as well as I think in the islands of like Puerto Rico. He has an activist niece who is a wonderful person, Allison, and she does a lot of good work trying to communicate and educate people all around the country and the world, in fact. He gives great sermons, and he is beloved by many people who are here as well as at the parish level. So thank you, Father Ken, for coming on and joining us. Appreciate your time and your energy to put this together as well, and much appreciated. Tag, you're it. Unmute, dude.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. It's nice to be with you. I know some of you here. It's nice to see your faces on the screen. And thanks to Eileen Flanagan for a wonderful presentation that I enjoyed very much. And it's very insightful. And she's got some great insights for all of us to think about it and think about our own participation. When I received the question, American democracy in peril, how do people of faith respond? My usual response to a question like this is to look at history. And as I looked at the history, I was reminded of the recommendation of the group started in Belgium, then spread to other countries, the JOC. It was called the Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne, which was in English, they call it the Young Christian Workers. And their approach to social issues was threefold: observe, judge, and act. And I thought I would use that as the structure for what I'm about to say, and just invite everybody to think about that. They observe, judge, and act. And the observation I would do in two parts. First is the history, and the second is the present situation. History, I think we, in all humility, have to admit that neither the Catholic Church nor the United States of America has really been a strong advocate for democracy, if democracy means welcoming everyone's participation in the political process. Demos, the Greek word, means the ordinary citizen, and democracy implies that all the ordinary citizens are invited into the power sharing, directly or indirectly. And that has never been the position of the United States of America. It has only recently been mildly advocated by leaders of the Roman Catholic Church. Just to give you a few examples, in the Catholic Church, when King John of England, I believe it was in 1215 or so, he signed the Magna Carta, which gave very, very limited power to the nobles. The Pope excommunicated him because the Catholic Church's position on authority is divine right monarchy. God selects the leaders, and if anybody else usurps that authority in any way, they are opposing what the Catholic Church would teach. And I think it reflects what Eileen said about the Catholic Church being a representative of empire. Undoubtedly, the Catholic Church has adopted quite a few things from the Roman Empire, and we still hold on to them. A second example was that in the Catholic tradition was the Catholic Church, of course, the leaders opposed the French Revolution, which was advocating rights for everyone, both men and women. There were repeated condemnations of democracy by popes, whose basic argument, again, was that God chooses the leaders. We can't have one pope referred to the unwashed masses, that they should not be selecting leadership. Vatican II was the first time that the Catholic Church actually officially recognized the positive value of democracy. And then Popes John 23rd, Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis have all, and John Paul I also, he was only in briefly, but they have certainly advocated for democracy, but not unequivocally, and they have their reservations about it. The second thing is the United States history. Also, when we started out, actually, when the Constitution was first approved in I think it was 91, they only 6% of by some estimates, only 6% of the people in the United States had the right to vote. Now, it's hard to get an exact figure because the right to vote was determined by the individual states, and they all had different rules. But the largest percentage that anybody gives is 18%, but the more recognized one is 6 to 10% of the people were allowed to vote. One interesting thing for New Jersey citizens is that New Jersey was the one state that allowed women to vote. However, they had to be single or widowed, because you had to own property in order to vote. And if you were married, your husband immediately confiscated all your property. And so women who were married were not property owners, and so they were forbidden to vote. There were, of course, the long battles for voting rights for Blacks from 1793 until 1865. And then the women's rights, the women started advocating for the right to vote in 1848. They didn't get it until 1920, although individual states allowed women to vote before that. So, but just as a starting point, the history isn't good. And both the Catholic Church and the United States of America have been rather tepid in their support of democracy. The present situation, of course, has changed. Things are different than they were years ago. But just a couple of quick facts. In the 2020 election, 67% of the citizens who registered for the census claimed that they voted. So that's 67%. That means the winner wins with 34% of the vote. So the winner is getting 100% of the power while taking only about 1/3 of the votes. This is hardly democracy. It is not the voice of the demos, the ordinary citizen. It's the voice of a small percentage of people, even though the turnout in the 2020 election was one of the highest in our history as a percentage of the population, percentage of the voting age population. But it's still quite small. And of course, the system is complicated because of the presidential system, at least, is complicated because of the electoral college. But then even more disturbing is the turnout for local elections or for elections in the off years, not the presidential years. The drop from 67% participation down to the 40s, 30s, and for local elections as low as 10 or 15% is quite common. I just heard a report recently that the election of judges is usually provides the lowest turnout, often in single digits, and yet judges have enormous effect on the society. And so the present situation is better. Women are able to vote much more so than the past. People of minority cultures and races are also able to vote much more than before, but many of the efforts to restrict voting raise the question about and I guess the question is then this the second step. So that's observation. We've seen our history. We've seen the present situation. There are lots of negative indicators there. The second thing we need to do is to judge, and judgments we can make about what is happening now. One thing that came to my mind as Eileen was talking was that we really ought to think through what we mean by freedom, because some of the people, for example, the rebel people who refuse to wear masks, it seems to me that their understanding of freedom has been kind of dissolved into convenience. That my freedom is my convenience to do what I feel like doing in the present moment without any regard to its impact on other people. That is not the traditional understanding of freedom in Western philosophy, Western history. That freedom is always related to the common good of everyone. And so when people identify freedom only with their own interests, rather than identifying freedom with the interests of the overall common good, we've got a serious problem. The second thing is to judge and ask ourselves what we think about voting. I mean, it's very, very clear that in the history of the United States, voting was seen as a privilege, not as a right, or certainly not as a duty or an obligation. It's a privilege, and the privilege was only for property owners at the beginning, mostly white male property owners. Many of the efforts that are going on today to restrict voting seem to be based on that principle, that one ought to be white in order to vote in the United States. One ought to have a certain amount of financial resources like property or other wealth. And that seems to be the understanding that voting is a privilege. It's reserved to people who have certain access to power already in the society. And the efforts to restrict voting are almost exclusively designed to stop everyone who's not a white male from voting, or at least make it more difficult for them. We could just make a judgment too about, there are different kinds of democracies, as we know, in the world. We have the parliamentary form of government in which the president or the prime minister is elected indirectly. The people vote for their local politicians, and the politicians who are elected then decide who actually carries out the executive function. That's something to think about. There are advantages and disadvantages. The American system is a winner-take-all system. As I said, 1/3 of the people get 100% of the power. That tends to be more efficient. The government can actually pass laws and can actually do things. The parliamentary system, where you have to have coalition governments where no political party gets 100% of the power, then what often happens is that very small political parties get leverage because they join coalitions and they get to vote the swing votes. cast the swing votes. And that has its advantages, has its disadvantages. Usually in a parliamentary system, the one big advantage is that everybody's represented. I lived in Italy for 5 years. In Italy, there were 3 or 4 major political parties, but then there were about 50 minor parties. And I worked with a peace group over there, and there was a radical party, had 1 member in the legislature, and that 1 member got all of our parade permits and helped us a great deal. But the Italian experience has been, over the last 70 years since World War II, has been everybody's voice is heard in the parliament, but it's very hard for the parliament to get anything done. And they went through long periods where the prime minister kept getting replaced. They had to run elections. The average life expectancy of a prime minister between 1945 and 1990 was 9 months. And so it's very hard to govern when you don't have the means of governing. You don't have the authority and the power. So we need to make judgments. And one of the judgments we need to make, the most basic one, is, do we really believe that the demos, the ordinary citizen, has the right to participate and the right to exercise power in the society? And Eileen brought up many issues that are connected to this, housing and not only voting, but housing and education and opportunity. So we need to think about that. The third step in the process then is to act. And I think Eileen's presentation, the whole presentation, gave us many good ideas about how to act. I believe it is important to, I would just encourage people, number one, to pick an issue. The issues are all connected. So it doesn't really matter which issue you pick one issue. Second thing is join a group. Groups offer all the things that Eileen talked about, the 4 different roles that she talked about. Those are present in groups that are working for justice. Where's my list here? Here we go. Let's see, the advocates, the rebels, the helpers, and the organizers. Every group needs those. And the more that these small groups get active in our culture, the more there's a possibility that the demos will actually be invited in. I think one of the big struggles is to get people to be active in local politics. The local politics does spill over into the statewide and the national realm. It's very important. As I say, the participation is very, very limited in local politics, partly because of the divisions that we've made and the partisan gerrymandering that has made most districts of the Congress so partisan that they're all one-party districts. There are very few districts left that are truly competitive. Encouraging signs to me, and from what Eileen was saying too, another thing came to my mind when she said that, it's often the middle, the people in the middle make the difference. And I heard one report on the public radio that the difference between the 2016 election and the 2018 election was largely Catholic suburban white women, because they voted for Trump in 2016 and they voted for the Democrats in 2018. And I think everything that Eileen said about appealing to people because of the values and appealing to the middle and using nonviolence are all actually went into effect in that vote in 2018. So now the interesting thing, this could be either encouraging or discouraging, but the 2020 election was the highest percentage turnout of registered voters in 100 years. And it was largely due to Donald Trump. He got the most votes of any Republican candidate ever in history, but then he galvanized the Democrats to come out too. And so they came out in large numbers to support Joe Biden. Now that's just the presidential election. But when we think about democracy, I am more concerned that we reflect that we do our observing, judging, and acting on the local level and the state level, as well as on the national level. Just to give one example that I was involved in was in the state of New Jersey, we had a long battle for a couple of decades over the driver's licenses for undocumented people in the state. And it took a long time. That took a lot of phone calls and a lot of meetings and public demonstrations and all the things that Eileen talked about. But eventually we got it passed. And of course, even when you pass the laws, you have to realize that the process continues, because immediately the motor vehicle department immediately started throwing all kinds of obstacles in the way so that people couldn't actually get the license. And we got that smoothed out after some negotiating with the motor vehicle division. But and that has happened all through history. When women got the right to vote in the 1920s, most of the polling places were in bars or other unseemly places that women wouldn't go to. And it was a 10-year struggle to get the voting, the polls moved to the schools where the women were more likely to go. So again, I would just offer that the perception of the young Christian workers, young Catholic workers from 100 years ago, that a three-step process: observe, judge, and act. Observe the history as well as the present day situation. Make judgments about the values that are really important, and then act in a way in concert with groups that identify a particular issue and work on that issue. And usually the effect of working on one issue has a positive effect on the others. So that would, I'd be open to questions and insights or reactions from people who are participating today.
Thank you very much, Father Hallahan. We do have a couple of questions posted in the chat box, and I'm going to start with one that's directed to both you and Eileen, and I'm going to suggest that Eileen answer first, because I know she's on a tight time schedule. Speak to the drastic change in our system since the enactment of Citizens United. It allowed corporations, millionaires, and now billionaires to lavishly spend huge sums of money on elections and candidates. And Eileen, could you go first? And then Father Callahan, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure, thank you. And first, I just want to affirm I really appreciated Father Kenneth's presentation and really agree with with all the things you said. So thank you. Again, I think it's important that we not have a dichotomy in our mind, like that there was a moment where we had a perfect democracy and then everything, kind of went awry at this one moment. I think there are times when things improved and times when things got worse. And Citizens United was certainly something that made it worse. But it's not like corporate involvement in our political system was new. It was just that the gate got thrown open a little wider for them. And honestly, it's part of the reason that I have kind of thrown down with Earthquaker Action Team, because we're addressing the corporations directly. So yes, we should try and overturn Citizens United. Prospects for that are probably not that good. Part of what I like about campaigning against corporations is they do care about their public image, especially financial institutions, which is what Equate has focused on in at least 2 of our campaigns. All 3 of them were against corporations that care about their public image. So just to explain what I mean, like if a pipeline company, last summer I went and I spent a month in Minnesota. Indigenous people, Ojibwe people were fighting a really terrible pipeline, Line 3 being built through their territory. And there was very courageous, nonviolent direct action trying to stop this pipeline. The pipeline company doesn't care how many people hate them. Like most people have never heard of pipeline companies. Their business model is not dependent on having a good image. Vanguard's is. Vanguard's business model depends on ordinary people thinking that they're a good company. Same with banks. And so it's part of the reason that the climate movement has targeted more and more those financial institutions where average people may have their savings, where pension funds, whether it's religious people or unions or teachers or what have you, like people collectively can say like, hey, you're doing stuff that's so bad, we don't want our money there anymore, or use the threat of moving their money, which is what we're doing in the Vanguard campaign. I actually have become convinced that our system is so broken with the influence of big companies that we might as well just campaign against the companies. And in some ways, they're more transparent than politicians, who very often say one thing while they're taking millions of dollars of people who are doing the opposite. So that may sound a little cynical, but I think it's more like just recognizing the role that they play in our society.
Thank you, Eileen. Father Hallahan.
Yes, I would agree with what Eileen is saying. And I think what we need to think about is, first of all, the recognition of corporations as persons. This, I think, is a serious, serious problem, but we've recognized it from the beginning, practically from the beginning of the formation of our country. As soon as you recognize corporations as persons, you're opening the doors to all the misbehavior that is happening now by corporations. And it seems to me the Citizens United decision was a decision that money is speech. And that's the judgment we have to make. Is money speech? Is it a form of speech? And if so, in both cases, corporations as persons and money as speech, what are the responsibilities and obligations that ensue from recognizing these realities? It appears as if people, again, they think that freedom means unlimited behavior, unlimited access to anything, unlimited behaviors of any kind, because I'm free, and if corporations are free, they're free to do whatever they want. And then speech. I mean, we have had limitations on speech from the beginning. You can't yell fire in the movie theater. People don't go to movie theaters anymore. You can't yell fire on Zoom. Well, so what's happening here is that we've identified corporations as persons and money as speech, and it seems to be almost an unlimited perception of these things, of the power and the access that goes with these two things. And I think there we have to start thinking it through and perhaps come up with the limitations. Yeah, okay, that'll be enough.
Thank you. And let me just add one comment of my own before I go to the next question, which, by the way, that's the last one I have in the chat box. So if you have another one, please put it in as ASAP. I think there is a tendency sometimes when we look at the deep corruption that money can bring into our political system, that you just throw up your hands and say, what I do doesn't make a difference, that we can't really overcome that huge advantage that people that are well-to-do have. And, there I would say, don't succumb to that kind of thinking and that kind of cynicism. But also, I think the facts often show otherwise. I mean, I can think of many candidates who have outspent their opponents and still lost. So many of them were millionaires and even billionaires. And so, money is not the only thing. It is troubling, certainly, if somebody, abuses our system and does this kind of use of money like Citizens United has allowed. It doesn't mean that we can't keep struggling and often overcoming those financial advantages that are in the picture. Okay, so here is, could you comment, Father Hallahan, on the how to communicate common good? In my experience, this questioner is saying, as soon as I add these words to a discussion about why to vaccinate or wear masks, I either end the discussion or escalate controversy. The words common good are sometimes not.
Okay, I didn't hear the last part of your last sentence.
After it's, he says that either ends the discussion or escalates the controversy. He says the words common good are sometimes not helpful.
Part of this, I think, is that we need to address our culture. And we have a culture in the United States of America in 2022, which is the most individualistic culture in the history of the human race. It is the most individualistic culture in the world today. The sources of that individualistic perspective, which is articulated by the libertarians, the Libertarian Party, and there are several sources. One is capitalism, which tends to recognize people as pursuing their own self-interest. The second is part of Protestant theology, which talks about Jesus, my personal savior, and my personal interpretation of the scripture. And the emphasis in that Christian perspective is more on the wisdom literature from the Hebrew Bible and less on the prophets and the law. The wisdom literature, very much influenced by Greek philosophy, emphasized individual holiness, individual goodness, and the individual life, whereas the prophets and the law of Moses talk about the corporate community and the responsibility to the corporate community. And then thirdly, in the United States, the political process as it has evolved has also emphasized individuals seeking their own self-interest rather than the interest of the overall community. See, it raises a really serious question of, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks debated the one and the many. How can you say we are one country? I mean, I remember doing that Pledge of Allegiance. One nation, indivisible. Really? What does that oneness mean? We've got 360 million people now. How can 360 million be one? I mean, it's a similar question. How can 15 be a family? How can 3,000 be a university? Well, how do you perceive oneness? What makes a group one? We pledged the allegiance. I remember when it was one nation, indivisible, without not under God. We put under God in when I was in second or third grade, and I'm still asking which God. Because certainly whatever God we're under is not the God of the Hebrew Bible. It's not the God of the prophets, and it's not the God of the law of Moses. Just to give you one example, God's public policy in the Jubilee year was confiscate all the wealth and redistribute it equally among everybody. That's God's will. That's God's public policy. And it's very much, very, very different from the individualism that we see in our society. Because God knew what the Jewish people knew too. If people are very, very, very wealthy, they did not earn it. They do not deserve it. They might deserve some of it, and they might deserve even a good deal of it, but they certainly are benefiting from the wealth that is created by the work of the laborers and by the accident of historical conditions and all the rest. So people are very, very rich, not because of their hard work, but because of lots of other things. And the people who create the wealth are often not benefiting to the extent that they should. But I would say that, the common good, to understand the common good, the Catholic Church does advocate the rights of the individuals, although we were late to the game on that. The church has often, for many centuries, has advocated private property, the right to private property. But the church has always said every individual right and every ownership of private property is circumscribed by the responsibility to the overall society. And I know the debate can get very raucous here in the United States at this time. But part of it, I think the basic difference is some people are primarily individualists, and the position is that any help that one offers to other people is the free decision on the part of the individual. There is no obligation to help the poor, the weak, the outcast, the stranger. They don't see that as an obligation. They see it as charity is fine. If I want to be a charitable person, and that's admirable, I can do it. But I have no obligation in justice to anybody who's suffering anything. unless I personally did something to them. And I think that it ignores the fact that we are social creatures and that we participate and we benefit. I mean, just to go back to the racial issue that Eileen illustrated so well in those pictures, it struck me, two of the pictures struck me. One was the signing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. There's Johnson. There are 12 people behind him, all white men. That was America, and that is America. And it's the cultural attitude of America for a lot of Americans. My perception has been that the cultural attitudes of the United States were largely controlled by the Ku Klux Klan from the late 1880s until at least the 1965 Civil Rights Act, 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act. But they still have enormous influence. So the Voting Rights Act, and then you notice that the 1963 speech of Dr. Martin Luther King at the mall in Washington, it was largely African American people. The crowd was mixed, but also that all the talk that Eileen gave so well, and that she pointed out so well, the helpers, the volunteers, the advocates were a very small percentage of the American population. They were a very small percentage of the churches. They were a very small percentage of the Black churches. It's very small groups of people that can make enormous impact on the society by raising these questions, but usually they do raise the question about the common good. Now, philosophers have different ways of talking about it. You can talk about the overall benefits of society. You can talk about participation in the society, universal participation. The common good is a term that comes out of natural law thinking, and the Catholic Church uses it a lot. Some people don't like it for that reason. If I could just say one further thing too, I think from our history, one thing we have to admit is both the Catholic Church and the United States of America have been quite willing to approve of violent methods of resolving issues. I mean, we have military solutions for almost everything. And the Catholic Church too. I was looking over the notes, just curiosity, of course, not that I'm going to engage in such activity, but there was a 300-year debate over regicide. When was it that you could kill the king? What did the king have to do that was so unjust that you could assassinate him? Because up until modern age, the last couple of 100 years, the only way anybody got replaced from authority was death. Usually it was natural death, but other forms, unnatural deaths, was used also. But because life expectancy was short, and because everybody was just presumed, everybody with any authority was really presumed to have authority from God, and therefore you couldn't remove anybody from authority. And death was the only way you got transition of power. That's why terms of office, and King George said about George Washington, if he steps down and lets go of power, he's the greatest man who ever lived, because nobody would do it. Now we do it. But just so we know that both of our political history and our religious history, is for those who are Catholics, the use of violence has been quite prevalent and approved of. They're less enthusiastic about it now in the Catholic Church, but in the United States, we still have quite a bit of it.
Okay, I see Eileen's hand up, and I think she wants to add something, and stay unmuted because the next question is also for both of you, Eileen. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question about the common good, and the piece that I've been thinking about. Well, first of all, it's so important for climate change, right? Because my self-interest is to use as much of the Earth's resources as I want to and not worry about anybody else. And I can afford to do that, to a certain extent. But the 5-day walk is actually starting in Chester, which is where a lot of our region's garbage gets burnt. So even just on that simple thing of what happens to my garbage, the people in Chester are breathing in the fumes from that garbage, which is also contributing to climate change. And the people who are going to suffer most from climate, who are already suffering and certainly will over this century, are not the people who consumed the most. And so it does feel to me that we're not really, as a planet, as a species, we are not going to really address this unless we learn to value the common good. And it's the most daunting thing to me, actually. Early in COVID, I was feeling optimistic, like maybe this is teaching people, and certainly many, many, many people did things for the common good, but then we saw the backlash to that. One thing that I've been thinking about, and I'm really curious, Father Ken, if there's anything from the Judeo-Christian tradition that can support this, but from my time with Indigenous people, the emphasis on our responsibility to future generations, there's something about that that is speaking to many people in the climate movement. It's not just, I should care about people in sub-Saharan Africa far away who I don't feel connected to, but the idea that my children are going to live through a rough time, or for many people, my grandchildren are going to be faced with the consequences of this. It's almost like a bridge between the selfish and the generous. I don't know, but the idea of our responsibility to future generations, as I reflect, I was actually raised Catholic and then I went to Ravenhill Academy, which is where Corazon Aquino went for a while. The woman who became president of the Philippines. But then I went to a Quaker high school, and to the horror of my Irish mother, left the Catholic Church and became a Quaker. But I married a Catholic, so the kids are baptized. It's all good. Anyway, I share that because in reflecting on my own religious education, I don't remember anything about an obligation to future generations. But it does seem to be a real moral issue and something that can potentially reach at least older people in talking about climate change.
Yes, that is a concern in ethical thinking and moral thinking, that ethicists are struggling with it because they're trying to think about it in terms of rights. Do future generations have rights? So usually you have to have an existing person to have rights. But there are questions about, do rights exist in groups of people or only in individuals? That was one set of one debate. The other debate is about the future. So most ethicists would not talk about the rights of future generations, but they would talk about the obligations of the present generation to not to destroy the earth, and that we do have obligation to future generations as a generic group. Almost as what do they call it when a group of people sue? It's called a
Class action.
Class action, yeah. That we have a class action, in one sense, obligation to the future, because although we don't know the individuals and we can't identify them and name them right now, we do know they're going to be here, and so there is an obligation to the future, and there's an obligation not to use up and destroy the goods of the earth. Although, just to note that there are some Christians, and one of them was the Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, who gave a public speech before he became Secretary of the Interior, said that Jesus is coming soon. The end of the world is coming. It's lack of faith not to use up all the resources. So, yeah. And he became, as people said, how much energy do you need to destroy the environment? 1 watt, James Watt. Well, so there are people that think that way from, again, a Christian biblical perspective, but then there are others, and again, it's more the secular philosophers and the mainstream Christians would say, yes, we have obligations to future generations. Yes, and there are a lot of them.
Thank you. Now here's a question for both of you as well, and so maybe Eileen, you could take this one first. In Australia, it's the law that all citizens have to vote. Very unlikely to happen here, but would you both please comment? Eileen, could you go first?
Yeah, I haven't really thought about it, to be honest. I'm curious how it would change the act to to be required by law or how that ever would be enforced. I agree that it's unlikely to happen here. But I think it goes back to this thing about responsibility. I don't think the leaders of our country have ever wanted everyone to vote. So it seems unlikely that they would, but how do we foster an expectation? You know, I think having it be a day off from work, having it be easier to register to vote. You know, if you get a driver's license, you're automatically registered. There are lots of things that other countries do that result in higher voter turnout than what we have. And I think we should do those things rather than make it compulsory. I'd be inclined to say, and DC doesn't have full voting rights, or Puerto Rico. Like, I think there are lots of places, even before we get to the recent bills, where we can expand the franchise in this country. But yeah, I haven't really thought about that, so I pass
Okay,
it.
thanks. Thanks. Father Hallahan?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because I lived in Italy for 5 years where it was obligatory, and they made it obligatory after the experience of having Mussolini. And they said everybody's got to vote, and voting there is not an easy matter. The voting all takes place on one day, and you have to go to the place of your birth to vote. You get 3 days off. You get a day off to travel, a day to vote, and a day off to come back. And I lived there at a time when a large part of the workforce lived in Germany and Switzerland and Northern Europe. And a lot of the Southerners lived in Northern Italy. But they enforced it by a fine, and it was a big fine. I mean, it wasn't little. It was like $500 if you didn't vote. And the Italians got worried if the turnout fell below 95%. We get 67%, which is, I believe it's 24th of the 200 countries in the world for voter turnout. So we're not near the top at all. But it does, it does, making voting obligatory would depend on recognizing the vote as a responsibility. Now, we have people too. A dear friend of mine has become a Jehovah's Witness, and the Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in voting at all. They just think that that's participating in the corruption of the world. So we'd have to make exceptions, religious exceptions. But there are a lot of people. I mean, again, 1/3 of the people never vote, and that's to me troubling, because again, it gives 100% of the power to people who get 1/3 or less of the vote.
Thank you. And here's a last question, because I need to save a little bit of time for a closing prayer, which I'm going to be leading. What do you see as the role / obligation of clergy to speak from the pulpit on racial justice, including voting rights? What might the backlash be?
Well, I take this one first. I think it's important to raise the issues. I think we do have to be careful. I mean, I'm particularly sensitive to pastors. In the Catholic tradition, the pastor is the one who pays the bills and has to raise the money. The assistants are the ones who don't have to do that. I've been a priest for 47 years. For 37 of those years, I was the assistant. I was only the pastor once, and it was in the city of Camden, so I didn't have any trouble addressing these issues. But I understand you've got to, especially in the Catholic tradition and suburban Catholic churches, predominantly white, you've got a congregation that is mixed. And you've got people, you've got Trump supporters, and you've got socialists. So you do have to present the issue, I think, at least present the values, invite people to address them, invite people to have their faith inform their political decisions. I think the American Catholic bishops have done a relatively good job. Every 4 years they publish recommendations to Catholics on how to vote. And they say, don't be a one-issue person, look into all the different, as many issues as you can, try to balance, recognize that you're not going to get 100% of what you want, and so make a judgment that is you think is the best for the overall common good of the people. but it is something that should be addressed. But I understand why pastors, especially in the Catholic tradition, are so hesitant to do it, because it could affect their bottom line.
Yes, and if I could just add one thing to that as I close, Eileen, I saw you might have been starting to say something, so I didn't mean to jump in front of you. Why don't you go next and go ahead?
Well, just that I'm not so much focused on clergy, but I do think, to the point that was made earlier, the right wing has been very good at wielding religion and claiming the moral high ground, even when it gave cover to things that were not at all what Jesus would endorse. And so I think I would have a general encouragement of all people of faith, who care about democracy, who care about justice, who care about peace, to be a little braver in speaking about the faith roots of those positions. Whether your position on the Thanksgiving table, I will not get into, like, what is the right time to have those conversations. But I think we so often go to Democrat versus Republican, instead of just very simply saying, I feel my faith calls me to X kind of action. I think that we need more voices claiming that. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And the comment I wanted to add is that, of course, for the Protestant clergy, it's a slightly different picture, which I'm a Protestant minister, because it's not only the ability to raise the budget of the church that's at stake, but you also can get fired in the Protestant churches. And so, a lot of clergy are very much looking over their shoulder. Now, I think there are some things that can certainly mitigate that. And one is to, be open to what your congregation is saying. That is to say, to make it more of a trialogue is actually the ideal for preaching. So it's supposed to be a trialogue between the congregation, God, and the minister. So if you want to always include the congregation in that trialogue, and in so doing, I think you're using a deep Christian tradition of communal discernment of what God is trying to say to us. It's not just one person's job. The clergy have a special role within that, but it's supposed to be communal nonetheless. So I think by being in touch, I do know of a colleague who was United Methodist and went over to try to stop the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, from starting by being a human shield. And oh my goodness, he was fairly new to the ministry, and oh boy, did all hell break loose. And so they quickly moved him to some tiny church in upstate New York. So that you basically get sent to Siberia if you do something that's sort of very outspoken like that. But I think that if we are committed to really respecting and hearing each other, let me just close by giving you one example from a congregation I served for 26 years in East Brunswick. And as that second Iraq War was breaking out, I spoke out on it quite a bit, and in fact invited people from the congregation to join in activism around that. And the moderator one time said, "Oh, we're getting flack about that," and that's often the way it really happens in churches, is they don't complain directly to the minister, they complain to the lay officials who have ultimate authority over, supervising that clergy person. So, so when that happened, I said, well, I don't have a corner on the whole truth. I was speaking it as I discern it myself. But why don't we just, instead of having a regular sermon on an upcoming Sunday, all sit in a circle and go around the circle and just share with how people, apply their faith and see this issue of the Iraq War. And as we went around, it was very exciting for me. Most people agreed with me, by the way, but some didn't. And one young African-American man, in fact, said, "I don't necessarily agree with everything that Pastor Bob says, but I'm glad he's saying it." because if he's not saying it, I don't know who will. That was one of the best compliments I think I've ever heard. And I really liked that approach to it. So, well, we are getting near the end of our time. I want to offer a closing prayer, and Bill and Steve, will that be it? Should I just move ahead, or do one of you want to say any closing word before the prayer? Looks like Steve's unmuting. Go ahead, Steve.
I am unmuting only to say that I have nothing to add. I think there are two speakers have given us
Yes.
quite a lot to think about, and have been very inspirational. And I want to
Yes.
thank them both. And
Yeah.
I want to thank you also, Bob. We kind of drug you into this, and very much appreciate the role you have
You're
played.
welcome.
And I will stop now.
All right,
Yeah.
Bill, you had something to add?
Well, just to, again, thanks to you for your effort at Coalition for Peace Action, which you have been a voice for a good 40 years. You advocate for an abolition of nuclear weapons, an end to war, and you're supporting for voting rights. You're doing a lot of work, not only locally in Princeton, but around the country in many respects. And we at Camden Sacred Heart have also been part of the Coalition to Stop Nuclear Weapons. We've been out with our banner out in front of Holtec, which is in South Camden, and as well as other places like at L3 Harris in Camden, to be there as a vigil, to be there and say no to weapons. So we support all of that. I thank you also, Danielle, for your being on and assisting us with making this happen today with Bob. Appreciate it immensely.
Yep.
Bob, you're on.
All right. Yes, thanks. I want to add that thank you to Danielle. You know, there's always people behind the scenes. I think, Eileen, you called them the helpers, and we had a great helper today with Danielle. So let me just offer this short prayer as we close, if you would join me in a spirit of prayer. Loving God, we thank you so much for this opportunity to spend this time together and to hear the good talks, the insights that have been shared, the dialogue. And loving God, we know that you value every single human being, that we are all your sons and daughters, your children in your sacred eyes. And when it comes to the issue of democracy and recognizing those equal rights, the sacredness of every person, our track record here in the United States has not been without blemish, loving God, and we see threats to it even today. And we thank you for this time when that problem, that very big problem in our democracy, has been exposed, and we've been educated about those dangers. And Lord, we also thank you, though, that the talks have also been about empowerment. And so as we turn to you, our loving God, we pray for the power from on high, your power. We pray that we would be empowered to be your agents of love and respect for every human being, and that ensure that every person in this country has their sacred right to vote protected, the right that is so much tied to our dignity and our empowerment in this nation. We pray your blessing upon all who have attended today. We pray your blessing upon all our elected officials. And loving God, we pray your blessing upon your entire earth, much of which is suffering as we pray this prayer. And especially we pray for the people of Ukraine and all other places where violence is taking place. We pray this prayer in your holy name. Amen.
So in closing, let me just add that, again, if you would consider donating a small donation to us at Sacred Heart, it would be made out to Sacred Heart with a memo in the memo line about peace ministry. Get it to either Joe Clemente or myself. My email address is in the chat. This session has been recorded, So it might be well available to anyone that you might have a relative or friend who couldn't be here or you would like to share it with. We might be able then to forward that so that you can be able to share the recording of this discussion regarding how do we as people of faith work to protect our democracy. And also one other ad, I put in something to the chat with Bob, but in 1980, Ronald Reagan was president. We had no billionaires in the United States. And today in 2022, we have over 700 billionaires in the United States who control so much of what goes on in terms of wealth, power, and control of things like legislation in Congress that affect all of us. So we need to speak out to those people as well. Thank you so much for being with us. For Steve, myself, for Sarah, Judith, Joe, we all give great thanks for your time with us today. And God bless all of you.
Bye.
Thank you.